Wind howled through the unchinked gaps in the cabin logs, carrying the bitter bite of an early Montana winter. She stood shivering by the stone hearth, eyeing the single, heavy bear-hide quilt on his mattress. She had nothing left to barter, no coin, no strength, nowhere else to run. When he caught her staring, his jaw tightened. He didn't offer empty comforts. Instead, he stepped close, blocking out the cold entirely. "If you sleep in my bed, you wake up as my wife." Ice clung to Clarissa's eyelashes, sealing them shut every time she blinked. Her leather boots, 2 sizes too big and stuffed with old newsprint, crunched through the knee-deep drifts. It wasn't snow anymore. It was a frozen, crystalline dust that scoured her cheeks raw and choked her lungs. She dragged her left leg. The muscle was cramping, seizing into a tight knot of agony that shot up her thigh. She leaned heavily against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, gasping. The air up here didn't feel like air. It felt like swallowing ground glass. 3 days. She had been walking for 3 days since the stolen mare threw a shoe and went lame near the river crossing. 3 days since she slipped out the back window of the saloon in Oakhaven, leaving Jalen Boone with nothing but a bloody lip and a missing purse of silver. Jalen wasn't the kind of man to let a woman run. He certainly wasn't the kind to let his money go. Clarissa pushed off the tree. Keep moving. If she sat down, she would die. It was a simple, cynical fact. The mountain didn't care that she was wronged. The winter didn't care about her bruised ribs or the hollow ache in her belly. A shape emerged through the whiteout. Square. Solid. A cabin. Smoke whipped horizontally from a stone chimney, torn away by the gale. Clarissa didn't feel relief. Relief was a luxury for people who trusted the world. She only felt a grim, desperate calculation. Whoever lived up here, far past the timberline, wasn't civilized. But they had fire, and fire was the only thing standing between her and a frozen grave under the pines. She stumbled across the clearing. Her knees buckled just as she reached the porch. She hit the rough-hewn planks hard, the impact jarring her teeth. She raised a heavy, numb fist and pounded on the heavy oak door. Once, twice. The door swung inward. A man filled the frame. He was massive, built like the granite ridges surrounding them. A thick beard, dark as wet earth, covered his jaw. His eyes, a pale, piercing grey, swept over her collapsed form. He didn't gasp. He didn't ask if she was all right. He held a split log in one hand and a heavy iron poker in the other. "We're closed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind. "Please," Clarissa croaked. Her lips cracked. A thin line of blood ran down her chin. "Fire." He stared at her. Wyatt Mercer had lived on this ridge for 5 years, isolating himself from the rot and noise of towns, from the treacherous nature of people. He knew what trouble looked like. It usually arrived half dead on a doorstep. He looked past her, scanning the tree line for a posse, a husband, or a gang of outlaws. Seeing nothing but driving snow, he sighed. It was a harsh, irritated sound. He dropped the log. Reaching down, he grabbed her by the thick wool of her stolen coat and hauled her inside like a sack of grain. The door slammed shut. The sudden absence of the wind was deafening. Heat washed over Clarissa, smelling of hickory smoke, curing leather, and strong, stale coffee. She crumpled to the floorboards, curling into a tight ball, shaking violently. "Don't get near the stove yet," Wyatt ordered. "You'll blister your skin off. Take the boots off." Clarissa's fingers were useless stubs of frozen meat. She fumbled weakly at the laces. Wyatt cursed under his breath. He knelt beside her, his movements brusque and entirely devoid of gentleness. He batted her hands away, untying the frozen leather strips with efficient, calloused fingers. He pulled the boots off, then the damp, freezing wool socks. He inspected her toes. Pale, waxy, but not black. "You're lucky," he muttered, tossing the boots toward the hearth. "Another hour I'd be chopping off your feet with a hatchet." "Thank you," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue. "Don't thank me. I didn't invite you." He stood up, towering over her. "I'll give you a blanket and a spot on the floor. When the storm breaks, you're gone." Clarissa didn't argue. She nodded, pulling her knees to her chest. She had survived Jalen. She could survive a grumpy hermit. She closed her eyes, letting the ambient warmth of the cabin slowly thaw the ice in her blood. The pain of the returning circulation was excruciating, 1,000 needles driving into her flesh, but she welcomed it. It meant she was still alive. Night fell like a heavy iron lid over the mountain. The temperature plummeted, seeping through the thick logs of the cabin. Clarissa lay on the hard plank floor, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that smelled of horse sweat and dust. The iron stove in the center of the one-room cabin glowed a dull, angry orange, but its heat barely reached her corner. She shivered continuously, her muscles aching from the strain. Wyatt sat at a small wooden table, cleaning a Winchester rifle by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The rhythmic snick-clack of the action was the only sound besides the roaring wind outside. He hadn't spoken 10 words to her since hauling her inside. He had handed her a tin plate of salted elk meat and a hard biscuit, then retreated to his silence. Clarissa chewed on a tough piece of jerky, her eyes tracking him. He was a hard man. Everything about him was sharp angles and suppressed violence. Yet the cabin was meticulously clean. The pelts on the walls were perfectly cured. The firewood was stacked with geometric precision. He wasn't a savage. He was deliberate. "Who is he?" Wyatt asked suddenly, not looking up from the oiled rag he was running down the barrel. Clarissa swallowed hard. "Who says it's a he?" Wyatt finally looked at her. The grey eyes pinned her to the floorboards. "Women don't walk into a blizzard for fun. They run from the law, or they run from a man. You don't look like a bank robber. His name is Jalen Boone." Clarissa saw no point in lying. "He runs Oakhaven. Decided he wanted to marry me. Decided my opinion on the matter wasn't required." "So you stole his horse and his coat?" "And his money." A muscle twitched in Wyatt's jaw. It might have been amusement, but Clarissa couldn't be sure. "Boone, I know the name. Mean bastard. Hires cheap guns to do his dirty work." "He'll send them," Clarissa said, her voice flat. "But not in this storm. No, not in this storm." Wyatt set the rifle down. He stood, his massive frame casting a long, dancing shadow across the room. He walked to the stove, throwing open the iron door and shoving 2 more thick logs inside. The fire flared, illuminating the harsh lines of his face. He walked over to the only bed in the cabin. It was pushed against the far wall, built of heavy pine logs and piled high with thick, luxurious furs. Bear and wolf. It looked like the warmest place on earth. Wyatt began unbuttoning his flannel shirt. Clarissa watched, a spike of anxiety piercing her exhausted haze. This was it, then. The toll for the fire and the food. She had expected it. Men always wanted a toll. She tightened her grip on the wool blanket, her cynical mind calculating how much she could endure to survive the night. "I'm sleeping," Wyatt said, tossing his shirt onto a wooden peg. His chest was broad, covered in dark hair and crisscrossed with faded, jagged scars. "Keep the fire stoked if you want to live." He climbed into the bed, pulling the massive bear pelt over himself, turning his back to her. Clarissa stared. He wasn't demanding payment. He was just going to sleep. An hour passed. The fire burned down a fraction, and the cold crept closer. Clarissa's shivering became violent. Her teeth clicked uncontrollably. The floorboards were sapping the heat right out of her bones. She scooted closer to the stove, but the side of her facing away from the iron felt like it was encased in ice. She was going to freeze to death inside a cabin. She looked at the bed. The furs looked so heavy, so warm. Desperation overrode pride. She stood up, wrapping the meager blanket tightly around her shoulders, and took a hesitant step toward the bed. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered. He didn't move. She took another step. "Wyatt." "I hear you," came the muffled, gruff reply. "I'm freezing. The floor." She hated the tremor in her voice. She hated begging. "I'll freeze to death down there." Wyatt turned over. He propped himself up on one elbow. In the dim light, his eyes were unreadable. He looked at her shivering, pathetic form. He saw the expectation of abuse in her posture, the cynical resignation of a woman who had learned that comfort always came with a violent price. He swung his legs out of the bed and sat on the edge. He didn't reach for her. He just looked at her, his expression hardening into something dangerous and resolute. "I don't share my bed," Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small room. "Not with strays, not with whores, not with passing strangers." Clarissa flinched, stepping back. "I'm not a whore. I didn't say you were." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I live alone because I choose to. I don't want complications. I don't want baggage. I just need to survive the night," Clarissa pleaded, anger finally cutting through the cold. "I'm not asking for your heart, mountain man. I'm asking for a corner of that bear skin." Wyatt stood up. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Clarissa braced herself, but she didn't retreat. She tilted her chin up, meeting his hard gaze. He looked down at her, seeing the fierce, unyielding fire beneath the bruised and battered exterior. She was a survivor. Like him. He didn't offer empty promises. He didn't soften his voice or spout poetic nonsense. He dealt in absolute, undeniable truths. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding, heavy. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the pine sap on his skin, feel the heat radiating from his chest. "If you sleep in my bed, you wake up as my wife." He growled the words. It wasn't a threat, it was a vow, a heavy, unbreakable iron chain of a statement. Clarissa's breath hitched. "You don't even know me. I know enough. There's no preacher up here. I don't need a man in a collar to tell me what's mine," Wyatt said softly, fiercely. "You get in that bed, Clarissa Dempsey, and you belong here. You stay. No running, no looking back. You become my kin, my responsibility, my blood. You accept that, or you go back to the floor." Clarissa stared into his eyes. She searched for deception, for the cruel trickery she was so used to. She found none. Just a stark, terrifying honesty. She had spent her whole life running, fighting, scrambling for scraps of safety. Here was a fortress. A brutal, uncompromising fortress. But a fortress nonetheless. "All right," she breathed. Wyatt didn't smile. He didn't say another word. He simply lowered his head and kissed her hard. It wasn't gentle. It was acclaiming. His lips were chapped, tasting of salt and smoke. His mouth moved against hers with a desperate, crushing pressure that forced a gasp from her throat. He pulled her against his bare chest, the heat of his skin searing through her cold clothes. Clarissa closed her eyes, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself in the sudden, overwhelming storm of him. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. He turned, walked back to the bed, and pulled back the heavy furs. "Get in." Clarissa dropped her ratty blanket on the floor. She climbed into the bed, fully clothed, and slid against the wall. Wyatt got in beside her. He threw the heavy bear pelt over them both, plunging them into absolute darkness and immediate, stifling heat. He didn't touch her again. He lay on his back, his massive form a solid wall of heat between her and the freezing cabin. Clarissa lay stiffly, listening to the steady, rhythmic thump of his heart. She had traded one master for a husband she didn't know. Yet, as the warmth finally seeped into her bones, melting the ice in her blood, she realized something strange. She didn't feel trapped. She felt safe. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a dull, grey seepage that crept through the frosted window panes. Clarissa woke to an empty bed. Panic, sharp and familiar, spiked in her chest. She bolted upright, clutching the thick fur to her chin. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of a fresh fire in the stove. The scent of frying bacon and boiling coffee hung heavy in the air. Wyatt was standing by the stove, fully dressed in his heavy canvas coat and boots, prodding thick slabs of meat in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced over his shoulder as the bed frames creaked. "You snore," he said flatly. Clarissa blinked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The memory of last night crashed over her. The cold, the bargain, the kiss. "Wake up as my wife." "I do not," she retorted, her voice thick with sleep. "Loud enough to scare the wolves off." Wyatt turned back to the bacon. "There's a tin basin by the door. Melted snow. Wash up. Food's almost done." Clarissa slid out from under the pelts. The air in the cabin was cold, but the fire was steadily beating it back. She walked to the basin, splashed the freezing water on her face, and hissed as it stung her wind-chapped skin. She stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging above the washstand. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her hair was a tangled rat's nest. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a refugee. She dried her face on a rough towel and walked over to the table. Wyatt set a chipped enamel plate down in front of her. Bacon, a fried egg with a deep orange yolk, and a thick slice of toasted bread. He sat across from her with his own plate. He ate quickly, efficiently, like a man who viewed food merely as fuel. Clarissa picked up her fork. "So," she began, the word feeling heavy on her tongue, "are we going to talk about last night?" Wyatt chewed, swallowed, and took a sip of his black coffee. "Nothing to talk about. A deal was made." Just like that. No courtship, no questions. Clarissa let out a dry, cynical laugh. "You don't even know if I can cook." "I can cook," Wyatt replied. "I need someone to watch my back when I'm skinning a buck. Can you shoot?" "I can shoot." "Good." He pointed his fork at her. "Then you pull your weight. You clean the traps, you mend the gear, you keep the fire burning when I'm out. In return, no one touches you. No one lays a hand on you ever again. Not Boone, not anyone." The absolute certainty in his voice made Clarissa's breath catch. He said it as a matter of simple physics. Water boils, wood burns. Wyatt protects his own. "Why?" Clarissa asked, leaning forward, searching his rugged face. "Why do you care?" "I don't care about the world," Wyatt said, his eyes locking onto hers. "The world is full of liars and thieves, but what's inside these four walls is mine. I keep what's mine safe. It's that simple." He stood up, grabbing his rifle from the corner. "I'm checking the perimeter. The snow stopped an hour ago. Wind is dying down." Clarissa watched him walk to the door. "Wyatt." He paused, his hand on the iron latch. "Thank you. For the food." He gave a curt nod and stepped out into the blinding white. Clarissa sat alone in the quiet cabin. She finished her meal, the food tasting better than anything she had eaten in weeks. She washed the plates in the basin, taking stock of the small space. It was sparse, brutally functional. But as she touched the rough-hewn table, the solid cast iron of the stove, the heavy wool shirts hanging on pegs, she felt a strange sense of ownership taking root. She wasn't a guest. She was the woman of the house. The thought was absurd, terrifying, and profoundly grounding. Outside, the glare of the snow was blinding. Wyatt trudged through the fresh powder, sinking past his knees. The storm had dumped 2 feet of fresh snow over the ridge, burying the landscape in pristine, deadly silence. He checked the woodshed. Intact. He checked the meat cache hung high in the pines, untouched by scavengers. He circled back towards the eastern tree line, where the trail sloped down toward the valley, and, eventually, Oak Haven. The wind had sculpted the drifts into sweeping dunes. Wyatt stopped. His eyes, trained by years of tracking game through brutal terrain, caught a disruption in the pattern. Beneath the sweeping branches of an ancient spruce, sheltered from the heaviest of the snowfall, the snow was broken. He waded closer, brushing aside a heavy bough. There, perfectly preserved in the sheltered pocket of ice, was a hoof print. It was large, shod, too big for a wild pony. Beside it was a boot print. A man had dismounted here. Wyatt knelt, pulling off his heavy leather glove. He pressed his bare fingers against the edge of the print. The snow inside the indentation was harder, older than the fresh powder on top. They had made it up the ridge before the worst of the blizzard hit. They had sheltered in the trees, waiting. They hadn't died in the storm. They had simply hunkered down. Wyatt stood up slowly. His eyes scanned the dense, dark woods sloping down the mountain. The shadows between the trees seemed to lengthen, holding secrets, holding violence. Jalen Boone didn't just send cheap guns. He sent men who knew how to track, men who knew how to wait out a storm. Wyatt gripped his Winchester tighter. His jaw locked. They were close, and now they weren't just coming for a runaway woman. They were coming for his wife. Wyatt didn't run back to the cabin. Running left deep, frantic tracks. Running signaled panic. He walked with the same steady, ground-eating stride he used to track elk, but his thumb rested heavily on the hammer of his Winchester. He stepped up onto the porch and slipped inside, pushing the heavy oak door shut behind him. The iron latch fell into place with a definitive clack. Clarissa was at the stove, a ragged dish towel in her hand, wiping down the cast iron. She looked up. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It wasn't just the draft of frigid air Wyatt brought in with him. It was the sheer, coiled tension radiating off his massive frame. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't take off his gloves. He walked straight to the wooden chest at the foot of their bed, flipped the iron clasps, and threw the lid back. "Get away from the window," he said. His voice was low, devoid of any inflection. Clarissa dropped the towel. She didn't ask questions. She had lived too long on the edge of a knife to need things spelled out. She moved quickly to the center of the room, putting the solid mass of the log wall between herself and the frosted glass. "Boone's men?" she asked, her voice tight. "They waited out the storm in the lower pines." Wyatt pulled out a heavy canvas bandolier, bristling with brass cartridges, and slung it over his shoulder. Next came a double-barreled shotgun, the stock scratched and worn smooth by years of use. He broke the action open, checking the chambers. Empty. He reached into a smaller box and pulled out 2 thick red paper shells, sliding them home with a satisfying double snick. He walked over and pressed the shotgun into Clarissa's hands. It was heavy, the cold steel biting into her palms. "Both hammers pull back," he instructed, pointing to the mechanism. "It kicks like a mule. Tuck it hard into your shoulder. Don't pull the trigger unless someone steps through that door. You understand?" "Yes." She gripped the stock. Her knuckles turned white. "How many?" "I saw 1 set of prints, but men who do Boone's dirty work don't ride alone. 2, maybe 3. Wyatt moved to the window, keeping to the side, peering through a small patch of clear glass where the frost had melted. Outside, the mountain was a blinding expanse of white and grey. The wind had died down to a low hiss, rustling the heavy boughs of the evergreens. It looked peaceful, It looked like a graveyard. They have to come across the clearing. Wyatt muttered, mostly to himself. Snow's thigh-deep. They can't move fast. They'll try to flank. Clarissa stood near the stove, the heat baking the back of her legs, the shotgun heavy against her chest. She watched Wyatt. He was a professional. There was no fear in his movements, only a grim, mechanical preparation. He picked up a heavy wooden bar from the corner and dropped it into the iron brackets across the door. Wyatt, she said. The name felt strange on her tongue, heavy with an intimacy they hadn't earned but had bargained for anyway. If they breach the cabin, you don't die for me. You let them take me. Wyatt stopped. He turned slowly, the Winchester resting easily in the crook of his arm. The grey eyes that locked onto hers were hard as river stones. We made a deal, he said. You slept in my bed. You're my wife. No one takes what's mine, not from my house. He didn't wait for her to argue. A sharp, echoing crack snapped through the frozen air. Wood splintered violently above the doorframe. A spray of dry pine showered the floorboards. The sound of the gunshot rolled across the ridge a second later, a flat, ugly boom that shattered the mountain's silence. Clarissa flinched, dropping low to a crouch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, sickening rhythm. Wyatt didn't flinch. He tracked the trajectory of the splintered wood. Rifle, tree line, dead ahead. He stepped to a narrow gap between the logs near the window, a chink he had purposefully left unpacked for exactly this reason. He leveled the Winchester, his breathing slowing, his body going completely still. Crack, crack. 2 more shots hit the cabin. One buried itself deep into an exterior log with a dull thud. The other shattered the top pane of the window. Glass rained down, crystalline shards sparkling in the dim light. Frigid air immediately howled into the room, sucking the heat from the stove. They're probing, Wyatt said, trying to see if I'm armed. He exhaled a long breath. Then he squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared inside the confined space of the cabin. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that boxed Clarissa's ears and left a high-pitched whine ringing in her skull. The smell of sulphur and burnt gunpowder instantly overpowered the scent of coffee and bacon. Wyatt racked the lever, the empty brass casing spinning through the air and clinking onto the floorboards. He fired again. A shout echoed from the trees. A man's voice, rough and sudden. It wasn't a battle cry, it was a yelp of pain. Clipped one, Wyatt said, stepping back from the chink to reload. They aren't moving up. They're waiting. Clarissa stayed low, her eyes scanning the reinforced door. She had spent a year running from Jalen Boone, jumping at shadows, sleeping with a knife under her pillow. Now the violence had finally cornered her. But as she watched Wyatt methodically slide fresh cartridges into the loading gate of his rifle, the cynical terror that usually gripped her began to recede. She wasn't alone. She had a fortress. She had a mountain man who considered her his property, his kin, his responsibility. It was a brutal, unromantic truth, but right now, with bullets chewing through the walls, it was the most comforting thing in the world. The standoff stretched. Minutes bled into an hour. The cold creeping through the broken window was relentless. Clarissa shivered, her breath pluming white in the air. She kept the shotgun leveled at the door, her arms aching from the tension. Wyatt moved silently between 3 firing positions, the window, the door crack, and a small knothole on the southern wall. He was a predator in a cage, watching the snow for any disruption, any shadow that didn't belong. Hey, mountain man, the voice drifted across the clearing, distorted by the snow and the distance. It was nasal, arrogant. Wyatt didn't answer. He just shifted his rifle barrel an inch to the left. We know she's in there, the voice yelled. Boone wants his property back. You send the girl out and we ride away. You keep her and we burn you both out. This cabin is dry timber. It'll go up like a match. Clarissa's stomach plummeted. Fire. That was how Boone operated. If he couldn't have something, he turned it to ash. She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's face was carved from granite. He pulled the hammer of the Winchester back with his thumb. "My name is Wyatt Mercer," he roared back, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing, commanding the space. "And this is my land. There's no girl here, only my wife. You take one more step out of those trees and I'll bury you under the snow." A beat of silence followed. Then a harsh laugh. "Your funeral, Mercer. They're moving," Wyatt said quietly, all his attention focused on the southern edge of the clearing. One circling back to the woodshed, trying to get an angle on the blind side. He looked at Clarissa. "I have to step out onto the porch. If I stay in here, they'll flank the chimney and toss a lantern through the window." Clarissa's eyes widened. "You'll be exposed. Only for 3 seconds." He walked to the door, resting his hand on the heavy wooden bar. "When I drop this bar, you cover the center of the clearing. If you see movement, you pull that trigger. You don't think, you shoot." She nodded, swallowing the dry lump in her throat. She pulled the heavy hammers of the shotgun back. Click, click. Wyatt hoisted the bar. He took a breath, his chest expanding under the canvas coat. He threw the door open. The cold hit like a physical blow. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, immediately dropping to one knee. Gunfire erupted. Dirt and snow exploded around Wyatt's boots. A bullet tore a chunk out of the porch post, inches from his head. He didn't flinch. He leveled his rifle at a shadow darting behind the woodshed. He fired twice. Fast. The shadow stumbled, a dark stain blossoming against the pristine white of the snowbank. A man pitched forward, clutching his chest, a rifle tumbling from his grasp. He hit the snow and didn't move. Crack! A bullet grazed the iron stove inside the cabin, showering Clarissa with sparks. She screamed, dropping flat on the floor. "Cover!" Wyatt bellowed from the porch. Clarissa scrambled up, throwing herself against the doorframe. Through the blowing snow, she saw a second man breaking from the tree line, charging the porch with a 6-shooter raised. He was screaming, his face red with exertion and rage. He was 50 yards away, then 40. Wyatt was turning, working the lever of his Winchester, but the mechanism jammed, a frozen casing caught in the ejector. He cursed, violently racking the lever, trying to clear it. The man in the snow kept coming. 30 yards. He raised his revolver, aiming straight for Wyatt's broad back. Clarissa didn't think. Instinct, sharpened by desperation and the ironclad promise of the man beside her, took over. She stepped fully into the open doorway. She tucked the heavy stock of the shotgun tightly against her shoulder, just as Wyatt had shown her, leveled the twin barrels at the charging man, and yanked the front trigger. The gun went off with a concussive roar. The recoil was monstrous, kicking her backward. She hit the floorboards hard, her shoulder exploding in a blinding flare of pain. Through the stinging smoke, she saw the result. At 30 yards, buckshot spreads. The man was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible giant hand. He landed flat on his back in a deep drift, a spray of crimson painting the snow behind him. The 6-shooter spun away into the powder. Silence slammed back down on the mountain. It was absolute, heavy. The ringing in Clarissa's ears faded into the low moan of the returning wind. Wyatt stood up slowly on the porch. He held his rifle. The jam finally cleared, but he didn't raise it. He stared at the body in the snow. Then he turned and looked down at Clarissa. She was sitting on the floor, gasping for air, clutching her bruised shoulder. The shotgun lay beside her, smoke still drifting lazily from the right barrel. She looked terrified, feral and utterly magnificent. Wyatt walked back inside. He pushed the heavy door shut, kicking the wooden bar into place. He leaned his rifle against the wall and knelt beside her. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He took her chin in his large, calloused hand, forcing her to look at him. His eyes searched hers, looking past the shock, past the fear. "You didn't run. he said softly. The gravel in his voice scraped raw. "Nowhere to run," she rasped, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. Wyatt's thumb brushed a streak of soot from her cheek. It was the gentlest touch he had given her since she arrived. It was heavier than the shotgun, heavier than the snow outside. "You killed a man for me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a cementing of their bond. Blood for blood. Life for life. "I killed him for us," Clarissa whispered, the reality of the words settling deep into her bones. Wyatt stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the hard, claiming crush of the night before. It was slow, deep. It tasted of gunpowder, copper, and a fierce, undeniable respect. When he pulled away, he pulled her up with him, wrapping his massive arms around her, shielding her from the draft, from the violence, from the world outside. "I'll bury them when the ground thaws," Wyatt muttered into her hair. "Right now, we need to fix that window." Wind whipped through the shattered window pane, carrying a fresh dusting of crystalline snow that hissed against the hot iron of the stove. Wyatt didn't waste a second looking at the bodies outside. The dead were dead. The cold was a living, breathing enemy currently invading his home. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling a cured, scrape-thinned elk hide from a stack near the corner. He grabbed a heavy wooden mallet and a handful of square-cut iron nails from a rusted tobacco tin. Clarissa remained on the floor, her back against the doorframe. The adrenaline that had fueled her was rapidly burning away, leaving a toxic, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Her right shoulder throbbed with a dull, nauseating rhythm. The shotgun lay beside her knee, a heavy, silent witness to the violence she had just committed. She had pulled the trigger. She had watched a man's chest cave inward. Wyatt slapped the thick hide over the broken window frame. He drove the first nail in with 3 brutal swings of the mallet. Bang, bang, bang! The sound made Clarissa flinch, her muscles pulling tight across her bruised shoulder. She let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. Wyatt paused. He drove the remaining nails in quickly, sealing the edges, plunging the cabin back into dim, amber-lit warmth. The howling draft was instantly muted to a frustrated sigh against the exterior logs. He set the mallet down and walked over to her. He didn't offer a hand. He knelt, his massive frame blocking out the rest of the room. "Take the coat off," he ordered, his voice low, scraping the bottom of his chest. Clarissa didn't argue. She fumbled with the heavy bone buttons of the stolen coat using her left hand. Her right arm felt disconnected, a useless weight hanging from her collarbone. Wyatt batted her clumsy fingers away. He undid the buttons with surprising dexterity for a man with hands the size of dinner plates. He eased the heavy wool off her shoulders, careful not to jostle her right side. Beneath the coat, she wore a thin cotton blouse, frayed at the collar and stained with dirt and sweat. Wyatt pulled the fabric down just enough to expose her shoulder. A massive, angry contusion was already forming. The skin was mottled with violent shades of plum and black, swelling rapidly over the delicate crest of her collarbone. The stock of the 10-gauge had slammed into her with the force of a kicked mule. Wyatt's jaw set into a hard line. He ran a rough thumb just below the swelling, checking the structural integrity of the bone beneath the damaged muscle. Clarissa ground her teeth, tears springing to her eyes, but she refused to make a sound. "Collarbone is intact," Wyatt muttered, looking up at her face. "Muscle is chewed up bad. You won't be lifting that arm for a week." "I hit him," she said. Her voice sounded hollow, distant. "I was going to shoot you in the back." "I know." Wyatt stood up, pulling her gently to her feet by her good arm. He guided her to the wooden chair by the stove. "Sit." He walked to a small wooden shelf above the wash basin and retrieved a dark glass jar. He unscrewed the metal lid. The sharp medicinal scent of arnica, pine pitch, and beeswax flooded the small cabin. He scooped out a generous dollop of the yellow salve and walked back to her. "This is going to burn," he warned. He didn't wait for permission. He pressed his fingers against the bruised flesh. Clarissa gasped, her good hand gripping the edge of the wooden chair so hard her knuckles turned stark white. The salve felt like liquid fire sinking into her skin, but beneath the immediate shock, a deep, numbing heat began to radiate through the agonizing knot of her shoulder. Wyatt worked the salve in with slow, methodical pressure. His touch was firm, completely devoid of pity, but fiercely protective. It was the touch of a man who understood pain and knew exactly how to dismantle it. "Jalen won't stop," Clarissa whispered, staring at the scarred planks of the floor. "He sent them. When they don't come back, he'll know where I am. Let him know." Wyatt wiped his greasy fingers on a rag. He pulled her blouse back up, covering the hideous bruise. "Those two out there were cheap muscle. Drunks looking for an easy bounty. Boone isn't stupid enough to ride up this mountain in the dead of winter. The passes will be completely choked with snow by tomorrow night. He'll come in the spring. Then we have until spring." Wyatt grabbed the shotgun from the floor, cracked it open, and plucked the spent shell from the chamber. He tossed it into the firebox of the stove. It melted with a quiet hiss. "You did well today, Clarissa." It was the first time he had used her name since the bargain. Hearing it in his deep, gravelly register sent a strange shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm a cynical woman, Wyatt," she said, finally looking up at him. "I've learned that a man's protection usually costs more than the danger he's shielding you from." Wyatt set the shotgun on the table. He leaned down, placing a hand on either arm of her chair, boxing her in. His grey eyes were intense, stripping away her defenses with ruthless efficiency. "I told you the cost," he said softly. "You belong here. You stand your ground. You don't lie, and you don't run. That's the price. I'd say you paid it in full today." He leaned in closer. The smell of gun smoke and pine sap clung to his skin. He kissed her. It was slower this time, deliberate. The bruising pressure of last night was gone, replaced by a deep, searching intensity. Clarissa closed her eyes, letting her good arm slide up his chest to grip the thick canvas of his coat. She anchored herself to him, letting the terrifying reality of her new life wash over her. She was a murderer, she was a runaway, and she was a wife. Winter tightened its grip on the ridge like a rusted iron vice. For 3 months the sun became a pale, useless coin behind a perpetual ceiling of bruised grey clouds. The snow drifted higher than the cabin windows, turning their home into a subterranean fortress. The bodies of Boone's men had frozen solid the night of the gunfight. Wyatt dragged them 50 yards into the pines and buried them under a massive cairn of deadfall and ice. The mountain claimed them, burying the violence under a pristine layer of white. Inside the cabin, a quiet, methodical rhythm took hold. Survival was a full-time occupation, leaving no room for the luxury of anxiety. Clarissa healed. The hideous purple bruising faded to a sickly yellow before disappearing entirely, leaving behind a profound strength in her right arm. She learned the exact idiosyncrasies of the cast-iron stove, managing the dampers to stretch their firewood through the agonizingly long nights. She learned to skin the snowshoe hares Wyatt brought back from his trap lines, pulling the hides off like bloody socks and stretching them over wooden hoops. Wyatt was a man of action, not words. He didn't offer reassurances or romantic platitudes. He spoke through the brutal labor of keeping them alive. He chopped wood until his shoulders screamed, ensuring the pile stacked against the interior wall never dwindled. He cleaned the rifles obsessively. He left the tenderest cuts of backstrap on her plate. Their intimacy grew not from shared secrets, but from shared silence. It was the intimacy of two solitary animals realizing they hunted better as a pack. One evening in late February, the wind finally broke. The eerie silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the shifting season. Clarissa sat by the stove, dragging a heavy bone needle through a tear in Wyatt's canvas coat. Her fingers were calloused now, her nails chipped and hard. She didn't look like the desperate, shivering girl who had collapsed on the porch. She looked like the mountain. Wyatt sat at the table, melting lead in a small crucible over a kerosene flame. He poured the liquid silver into a bullet mold with a steady, practiced hand. "The ice on the eaves is dripping," Wyatt said without looking up. Clarissa paused her stitching. She listened. A slow, rhythmic plink. Plink. Plink echoed from the heavy timbers outside. The thaw. Her stomach gave a familiar, cynical twist. The snow was the only thing keeping Jalen Boone in Oakhaven. When the passes cleared, the real war would begin. "How long?" she asked, her voice flat. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the mud freezes over at night. Wyatt popped the mold open. A shiny, perfect lead cone dropped onto a damp rag. "He won't send cheap guns this time. He'll come himself. He'll bring his regulators." "You're making extra ammunition," Clarissa noted, watching the pile of raw lead bullets grow. "I'm making enough to turn this ridge into a slaughterhouse if I have to." Wyatt set the mold down and blew out the kerosene flame. The cabin plunged back into the amber glow of the hearth. He stood up and walked over to her. He reached down, taking the canvas coat and the bone needle from her hands, tossing them gently onto the nearby trunk. He pulled her to her feet. "I'm not afraid, Wyatt," Clarissa said, and the realization hit her that it was the absolute truth. She had spent a year terrified of Boone's shadow. Now, standing in front of this massive, scarred man, the fear felt distant. Hollow. "You should be," Wyatt murmured, tracing the line of her jaw with a rough knuckle. "Boone is a cruel man. He fights dirty. I fight dirty too." She tilted her chin up. "I shot a man in the chest." The corner of Wyatt's mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on him. It was feral, a flash of teeth in the dark. "Yes, you did." His hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the thick mass of her hair. "You're a harsh woman, Clarissa Mercer." Hearing her new name spoken aloud sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. It wasn't a bargain anymore. It wasn't a desperate trade for warmth. It was a brand. "I had to be," she whispered, her hands finding the thick leather of his belt, pulling him closer. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He crushed his mouth against hers. It was a kiss fueled by the months of isolation, by the endless cold, and by the looming specter of death waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain. He swept her off at her feet, one massive arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. Clarissa wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, inhaling the deep, intoxicating scent of wood smoke, sweat, and iron. He carried her to the bed, dropping her onto the heavy bear pelts. He came down over her, his broad chest pressing the breath from her lungs in the most exquisite way. There was nothing gentle about their joining. It was raw, urgent, and fiercely possessive. The creak of the heavy pine bed frame drowned out the sound of the dripping icicles outside. In the suffocating warmth beneath the furs, Clarissa surrendered the last of her cynical armor. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. And as Wyatt's heavy, rhythmic breaths slowed against her neck in the quiet aftermath, she stared up at the log ceiling, her mind perfectly clear. Jalen Boone was coming. Let him come. He would find that the terrified girl he chased out of Oakhaven was dead. In her place was a woman who belonged to the mountain, and she would happily paint the melting snow with his blood. Spring tore through the high country like a violent fever breaking. The pristine white expanse dissolved into brown slush, exposing sharp shale, rotting pine needles, and the ugly, scarred earth beneath. Meltwater roared down the steep ravines, a constant deafening rush that masked the subtle noises of the forest. The air hung heavy, smelling of damp soil and ancient decaying wood. Wyatt did not celebrate the thaw. He prepared for it with the grim, mechanical focus of a man digging his own trench. He spent 3 days hauling massive, waterlogged spruce trunks across the main trail leading up to the clearing. He created a brutal, staggered barricade that would force any mounted riders to dismount and climb through knee-deep sludge. On the eastern flank, where the tree line offered the only real cover for an advancing force, he buried 4 heavy steel bear traps. He set the rusted iron jaws wide, concealing the pressure pans beneath a thin crust of wet leaves and loose mud. Inside the cabin, Clarissa worked with matching intensity. She sat at the heavy wooden table, methodically pressing lead bullets into brass casings, crimping the edges with a hand tool. Her hands were dark with grease and gunpowder residue. She loaded 3 spare cylinders for Wyatt's Colt revolver, setting them in a neat, deadly row on the scarred wood. They barely spoke. They didn't need to. The looming threat of Jalen Boone had become a tangible third occupant in the small room, breathing down their necks, forcing their every movement into a calculated strategy for survival. "They won't come up the main trail first," Wyatt said on the 4th morning of the thaw. He stood by the stove, running a whetstone down the blade of a heavy hunting knife. "Shk, shk. Boone is arrogant, but isn't stupid. He'll send scouts to probe the tree line." "And when they find the traps?" Clarissa asked, not looking up from the ammunition box. "They'll know I'm waiting." Wyatt slid the knife into the leather sheath at his hip. "It'll slow them down. Make them paranoid. Paranoid men make mistakes." He walked over to the table, his large hands resting on the back of a chair. He looked down at the neat rows of ammunition. He looked at her calloused fingers, the fierce set of her jaw, the way her hair was braided tightly back to keep out of her eyes. She was a weapon forged in the brutal furnace of his cabin, hardened by winter and necessity. "You stay away from the window today," he ordered, his voice low. "If things go wrong, you use the shotgun. You hold the door. You don't surrender. Boone doesn't take prisoners, Clarissa. He takes trophies." "I know what he takes," she replied coldly. She turned in her chair, looking up into his harsh, grey eyes. "I'm not going back to Oakhaven, Wyatt. Not breathing." He held her gaze for a long moment, the silent vow passing between them, heavy and unbreakable. Then the shrill, panicked cry of a Stella's jay echoed from the eastern pines. Wyatt snatched his Winchester from the table. "They're here." Clarissa grabbed the double-barreled 10-gauge. She moved instantly to the reinforced corner by the stone hearth, putting the solid mass of the chimney between herself and the door. Outside, the mountain held its breath. The rushing meltwater seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy, sucking sound of boots dragging through thick mud. "Mercer." The voice cut through the damp air. It was refined, carrying an aristocratic lilt that sounded entirely alien up here in the raw wilderness. Jalen Boone. Wyatt stepped to the narrow chink near the doorframe. He peered out. 6 men stood at the edge of the clearing. They were soaked, covered in mud up to their thighs, leading exhausted horses. 5 of them were regulators, hired guns in long canvas dusters, carrying repeating rifles. They fanned out slowly, their eyes scanning the cabin, the woodshed, the tree line. In the center stood Boone. He wore a tailored wool suit beneath a heavy leather coat. His boots, though caked in sludge, were fine, polished calfskin. He looked entirely out of place, yet radiating a casual, terrifying authority. "I have to admit, Mercer," Boone called out, resting a silver-inlaid walking stick against his hip, I expected you to be gone. Most men run when they realize who they've stolen from. Nobody stole anything, Boone, Wyatt shouted back through the heavy oak door. His voice was a physical force, deep and resonant. She walked up here on her own 2 feet. She's my wife now. You're trespassing. Boone laughed. It was a sharp, humorless sound. Wife, you think a few words mumbled in the dark make her yours. She is my property. She took my silver. She took my pride. I am here to collect on both. Boone raised a gloved hand. The 5 regulators instantly brought their rifles up, leveling them at the cabin. Burn it, Boone ordered, his voice suddenly dropping its theatrical lilt, turning flat and dead. Burn him out. Bring the girl to me. Down, Wyatt roared, dropping to a crouch just as the first volley tore into the cabin. Wood splintered violently inward. Lead slugs chewed through the heavy pine logs, filling the air with jagged shrapnel and a blinding cloud of dry sawdust. The noise was apocalyptic, a continuous, deafening roar that rattled the iron stove and shook the floorboards beneath Clarissa's boots. She pressed herself flat against the rough stone of the chimney, her hands clamped tightly over her ears. The cabin was disintegrating around them. Wyatt didn't cower. He waited for a break in the volley, timing the mechanical rhythm of the regulators' lever-action rifles. When the firing stuttered as the men paused to reload, he rose smoothly to the chink. He didn't fire blindly. He picked a target, a tall regulator moving rapidly towards the woodshed with a glass lantern in his hand. Wyatt squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. The regulator's head snapped back, the lantern shattering on the rocks, igniting a useless pool of kerosene in the mud. One down, Wyatt yelled over the ringing in his ears. A sharp, metallic snap echoed from the eastern tree line, immediately followed by a horrifying, high-pitched scream. One of Boone's flanking men had found a bear trap. The heavy iron jaws had shattered his tibia, pinning him to the earth in a thrashing, agonizing heap. Don't stop shooting, Boone bellowed, his composure cracking. He drew a heavy Schofield revolver from his coat and fired blindly at the door. Flank the rear! Get behind the structure! 2 regulators broke off, sprinting heavily through the mud toward the back of the cabin. They're moving back, Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He racked the lever, ejecting a smoking casing. I have to stop them before they get an angle on the rear window. He stepped away from the wall, moving toward the heavy wooden bar securing the door. Wyatt, no! Clarissa screamed, stepping out from the chimney. It's a crossfire. If they breach the back, we're boxed in. He looked at her, his grey eyes burning with a fierce, terminal clarity. Hold the front, Clarissa. He hoisted the bar, kicked the door open, and threw himself out onto the porch, rolling hard to the left to avoid a hail of bullets tearing through the entryway. Clarissa scrambled to the doorway, dropping to her knees. She hauled the heavy 10-gauge up, leveling it at the clearing. Boone was screaming orders, pointing his silver-inlaid cane towards the porch. A regulator stepped out from behind a massive pine, drawing a bead on Wyatt, who was pinned behind a stack of cordwood, returning fire at the men in the rear. The regulator had a clear shot at Wyatt's exposed back. Clarissa didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the recoil, or the morality of taking another life, or the cynical realities of the world. She thought only of the massive, scarred man who had given her a fortress. She pulled the front trigger. The shotgun roared, kicking her shoulder with brutal force. The spread of heavy buckshot caught the regulator squarely in the chest. He folded instantly, dropping into the mud like a puppet with cut strings. But the muzzle flash had exposed her. Boone turned. He saw her kneeling in the doorway, the shotgun smoking in her hands. His handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. He raised his Schofield, aiming directly at her chest. Crack! Boone jerked violently sideways. His shot went wild, burying itself in the porch roof. He stared down at his right thigh. A dark, rapidly expanding stain was blossoming across the fine wool of his trousers. Wyatt stepped out from behind the cordwood. His Winchester was still leveled, smoke curling from the barrel. He had ignored the men in the rear to take the shot at Boone. "I told you!" Wyatt's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying absolute authority. "She is my wife." Boone collapsed to one knee, clutching his leg, his aristocratic arrogance entirely shattered. He looked around. 3 of his men were dead. 1 was screaming in a steel trap. The remaining 2 regulators, seeing their employer drop, exchanged a single, panicked look. They didn't get paid enough to die in the mud. They turned and bolted down the trail, abandoning their horses. The silence that descended was abrupt and absolute, broken only by the rushing meltwater and the ragged gasps of the trapped man in the trees. Wyatt walked slowly across the clearing. His boots sucked heavily in the mud. He stopped 3 feet from Boone. The crime boss was pale, shivering, trying weakly to raise his revolver. Wyatt didn't shoot him again. He simply stepped forward and kicked the heavy Schofield out of Boone's trembling hand. "You crawl back to Oakhaven," Wyatt said, staring down at the ruined man. "You tell them what lives on this mountain, and if I ever see your shadow on my ridge again, I won't aim for the leg." Wyatt turned his back on Boone. He walked across the ruined clearing, up the splintered steps of the porch, and stopped in front of Clarissa. She was still kneeling, the empty shotgun resting across her thighs. She looked up at him. His canvas coat was torn, his face smeared with soot and mud, but he was whole. He reached down, grasping her by the upper arms, and hoisted her to her feet. He didn't say a word. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a desperate, crushing strength that finally betrayed the terror he had refused to show during the fight. Clarissa wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, anchoring herself against his solid mass. The scent of burnt powder, wet earth, and sweat enveloped her. They stood there in the shattered doorway of their cabin, listening to Jaylon Boone drag himself through the mud down the mountain. The cold was finally broken. The war was over. Clarissa closed her eyes, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of Wyatt's heart against her chest. She had climbed this mountain as a desperate stray, looking only for a fire to keep from freezing. She had bargained her body for a night of survival. But as the spring sun finally broke through the grey clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the ruined clearing, she knew the cynical truth of the world didn't apply here. She hadn't just survived, she had found her home. Thank you for listening to the final chapter of this Wild West romance. If Clarissa and Wyatt's gritty fight for survival and love kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this story with your friends. The West is wild, but love on the mountain is wilder. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss an epic tale of frontier justice and romance. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of the standoff? See you in the next video.